So, my first point to you is, what do you think were the reasons behind Israel agreeing to this ceasefire deal? What was in it for them?
Yeah, and let's acknowledge some of what you said, Daisy, in as much as that pager booby trap attack pretty much fits a classical definition of the deployment of terror. It terrorized a civilian population, and something that has become known as the Dahia Doctrine, which was first deployed and vocalized, talked about by Israel's political military leaders in 2006 in the previous very intense exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah, in which Israel openly said, our military strategy involves the targeting of entire civilian neighborhoods. And we saw that deployed to horrendous effect. Of course, what's going on in Gaza has been a degree of criminal cruelty that surpasses anything, but we saw it deployed to horrendous and devastating effect inside Lebanon. As you mentioned, the destruction of villages that will almost certainly never re-emerge, some of which are hundreds or thousands of years old. The killing of relief workers, of medical workers, people being displaced in a mass fashion. So all of that has been going on. And now let's come to, what are the circumstances which brings that to at least a plausibly sustainable partial closure, because I'm sure we'll come on to the violations of this ceasefire. Yeah. And I think there are a couple of layers of explanation to unpack here. So let me try and do that. And the first is, the terms are actually quite favorable to Israel, and we've seen how that has subsequently played out. So first of all, I think the Israeli officials involved in this would point to the successful delinking, disconnecting of the military exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah to what is going on in Gaza. That was something that Hezbollah said would not happen. It is something that very clearly does happen in this ceasefire. In fact, the terms, the statement, the announcement that was actually made on the morning of the day when Nasrallah is assassinated spoke of, if you remember, the Americans and the French announced that the deal's been reached, we're anticipating the parties. So clearly they had a deal. Clearly the Israelis had hoodwinked them, or they'd changed their mind. I think the former is more likely. That had linkage, because it talked about in the initial, I think it was a 21-day pause that was envisaged in that arrangement, which never saw the light of day. That period of time was going to be used in order to implement both a ceasefire on the Lebanese front and to secure a ceasefire in Gaza. So there was an element of linkage that was maintained. Anyway, the terms, both the delinkage and the extent of American oversight and ownership, the French thrown in there because it's Lebanon for a bit of good measure. They are playing a role, but they have their folks who are part of this oversight mechanism. But this is an American-driven thing. It allows Israel certain very problematic, and they've played out problematically, privileges in terms of how this was going to be implemented. So I think Israel would look at this first of all and say, the terms of the deal are really okay. There's a side letter from the Americans, as we know, not the first time that has been done. In 1996, there's a side letter from then Secretary of State Warren Christopher. So nothing new under the sun in terms of how the Americans seek to guarantee Israel's freedom of action and impunity. That's one level, the terms of this arrangement. The second level that we have to look at, though, are the internal Israeli dynamics. And let me comment on that.
Yes.
And here, I would draw attention to two important points. First of all, when it comes to Israeli politics and public discourse, such as it is today, Lebanon and everything else holds a different place to the Palestinians. There is a commitment in the current government, and I don't think it is limited to the members of the current government in terms of the Israeli body politic. There is a commitment to maximalist goals vis-a-vis the Palestinians, to the dispossession, the accelerated dispossession, the continuation and acceleration of ethnic cleansing, and to the settlement of Palestinian land, which does not hold for anywhere else, even though one could say, well, what the hell are they doing going into Lebanon, now going into Syria, which we'll come to. But it is of a different order of magnitude. Actual existing Zionism has always had to be primarily at the expense of Palestinians. So the Israeli coalition, if one goes down to really narrow political questions here, people will be familiar already with the names of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the hard right partners, even harder right partners of Netanyahu. By the way, the Likud, much of it, Netanyahu's governing party, is indistinguishable ideologically from where Ben Gvir and Smotrich are often at. But if you want to hold your coalition together and your Netanyahu, anything that even has the word agreement with Palestinians written on the tin is almost an anathema to that coalition, whereas you could do that on the Lebanese front, and that's been borne out by the reality. The coalition hasn't collapsed. There was some criticism, but the cabinet voted in favor of that. Which brings me to the next level, which is partly why Israel went for that deal, is that it had reached a crossroads in the military operation, which intensified, as you shared with us, in September in Lebanon. And the crossroads was the following: having begun a ground incursion, and while that ground incursion was devastating for the affected villages in South Lebanon, it did not go swimmingly for the Israeli side. There were Israeli losses. And this came on top of a period in Israel where the Israeli military were already suffering from manpower shortages, fatigue. People were serving very extensive periods of reserve duty. And so you then had the option of either cutting a deal or the inevitability that momentum would drive Israel in further, requiring further troops. So it was either going deeper into Lebanon with all that entailed in terms of the extra burden on the IDF, or cut a deal. So it wasn't just the terms of the deal. It was also that Israel knew that this was burdensome, problematic for its own side, and at the risk of overloading the cart in terms of what I'm trying to convey here, there's also a specific problem for Netanyahu, which is that the big threat to his coalition is not that anyone's saying, how could you possibly do that in Lebanon and Syria, let alone with the Palestinians? No, that wasn't the threat. The threat to his coalition is he has to balance the interests of the partners in that coalition, one of whom is the ultra-Orthodox parties. And the ultra-Orthodox parties, known as the Haredi parties, their primary interest is right now, in terms of serving their own community, is to keep the funds flowing for their religious seminaries, their madrasas, they're called yeshivas in the Jewish Israeli parlance, to keep the money flowing for their yeshivas and to get legislation passed to make sure that their young people will continue to be able not to serve in the military. So they don't serve in the military, okay? And it's important in that respect to note that it's really hard to win the argument politically that these folks could continue not to serve when those who do serve keep getting called up for more tours of reserve duty. So to get closure and therefore to be able to demobilize some folks, to not place such a burden on the reservists by having a ceasefire in Lebanon, I think Netanyahu hopes will in the coming weeks and months translate into making it easier for him to manage that question with his coalition. So that for me, much more than an anticipation of what was about to happen in Syria, I'm probably preempting something that's coming up in our conversation, much more than that explains how we got to where we got to on the Lebanon-Israel front.